So I want to ask you one question that was asked in the documentary. Is Christian nationalism Christian? Why or why not?
So I actually think that's not the most important question we have to deal with. I think a better question to wrestle with is, what responsibility do Christians have to confront white Christian nationalism? So when we say, is white Christian nationalism Christian, often the motivation is to say, well, no, it's not, therefore we don't have to be identified with it, and it's maybe even someone else's problem. But the reality is, white Christian nationalists pray, they go to church, they read the Bible, they have crosses, they sing songs, they break bread together. They do all of the outward external things that people would associate with Christianity. And do I believe they are following the way of Jesus? No, of course not. But that's not where the question ends. The question has to go on to say, well, if they are claiming the name of Christ and doing these very un-Christ-like things, then what is my responsibility as a person of faith to confront that? So, yeah, we can talk all day. I think in particular, white Christian nationalism is a violation of the third commandment, which is, do not take the Lord's name in vain. Which of course is not cussing, right? It means don't do in God's name that which God would never condone. And white Christian nationalists do that all the time. So it's a violation. It's not Christian in that sense. Yet and still, we have to go further and say, well, if that's not Christian, how do people who are truly committed to the way of Jesus show a different Christianity and a different witness?
Is Christian nationalism new?
That's a historical question. Thank you. That's a nice alley-oop there. It's not new. I can go all the way back to the papal bull Dum Diversus and talking about Europeans going out and conquering other lands and converting pagans to Christianity, and that being God ordained. And by the way, you can take all of their natural resources and riches along the way. But I'll do a little bit more recent history. So there is, people may be aware that there is more than one wave of the Ku Klux Klan. The first wave came immediately after the Civil War. The third wave came in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement. It was that second wave which was the most widespread and the most violent. And that came during the Jim Crow era. So it was literally revived in 1915, partly spurred by the Birth of a Nation movie, which was propaganda around the Civil War and the birth of the Klan. But then the founder of that second iteration of the Klan was a man named William J. Simmons, the Grand Dragon. And there was some controversy about the KKK, and so he did a news interview in which he explained what it was about. And I want to read this passage to you. It comes from a New York Times article in 1922, and see if you can hear any sort of resemblances. The Ku Klux Klan admits membership to none but native-born, white, Gentile, Protestant Americans whose statement of principles was a restoration of the fundamental principles of American democracy as embodied in the Constitution of the United States, an organization whose code of conduct was Christianity. Native-born, not an immigrant. White, not black, not Japanese, not Mexican. Gentile, this is the anti-Semitism coming in. At this point, it was Protestant Americans, but today's version of white Christian nationalism will admit Catholics and mainliners, whose statement of principles was a restoration of fundamental principles of American democracy. They go back to the founding documents, the Constitution, which they say is a Christian document, which this is high school civics. Like, it was explicitly not to establish a state religion. They were really mad at King George for that. Matter of fact, a lot of European immigrants came to what became the United States to escape religious persecution. Because if you didn't practice the state religion the way the state wanted you to, you could face sanctions. You could be fired, you could be in prison, you could be killed. Well, guess what? That's what's on the horizon in the US for people who don't practice the kind of religion that white Christian nationalists want them to practice.
So what would you say today to ordinary US citizen living in Little Rock, Arkansas? What would you say to faith communities today? And I wonder what you might say to a Trump supporter today.
So faith communities would encompass more than just Christians, and this is why it's important that we understand that white Christian nationalism affects more than just Christians. This is about religious freedom. What white Christian nationalism wants to do is enshrine through the law Christian privilege, a certain fundamentalist, traditionalist Christian privilege, not the kind of Christianity you're practicing, social justice and love of neighbor kind of Christianity. It wants to enshrine, this very power-hungry, not the way of Jesus kind of faith. Now that's going to affect people who are not Christians, people of other religions, and people who don't practice religion at all. Because if you are not that kind of Christian, not only will you not be privileged, but if you are not Christian in any sense, it'll come down harder on you because you're seen as more of an other, right? So this goes across people, across faith groups. And what I would say to a Trump supporter is, you're being invited into a community. And you have a choice about what kind of community you want to be invited into. The community that MAGA invites you into is one that builds walls to keep out other people who they say are the enemy. It's one where you constantly have to look over your shoulder for threats. It's one where you have to constantly agree with the powers that be, or you could find yourself outside of those walls. It is a kind of community that can only exist by taking power from others and using that power to control people. And it is a kind of community that fundamentally rests on a foundation of fear and control and hatred at the end of the day to survive. Or, since many supporters of MAGA and Trump call themselves Christian, you can say, but Jesus invites you into a different community. Remember Acts chapter 2, when all of the disciples shared their belongings and no one had any need. What Jesus is inviting you into is a community founded on the principles of love and generosity and sharing and welcome. Not one that builds walls, but one that builds bridges and lets people in knowing that everyone in this community will be cared for because everyone in this community counts.
Amen.
Which community do you want to be a part of?
He says he doesn't preach. I think we might have time for one question from the audience today.
All right, so we're dealing with Christian nationalism here, but I think the broader thing would be religious nationalism. So from a historical standpoint, historically you see patterns, right? So from where I'm at right now, I do my best to follow Jesus, who came to set people free from our sin. Okay? And I do that with my family. I do that in my neighborhood. And I look out and I see his name being used in ways that they make me angry, and I try not to be angry. And they make me sick, and they continue to make me sick. And I think about where we're headed, with the use and the co-opting and the distortion of his name. We came in the flesh to set us free. And And I look around and I'm like, I don't see where we're going. The only way I can see from my limited perspective and where I'm at is it just going to get worse. But I think historically, you talked about the waves of Christian nationalism and all that. There's cycles. So from your perspective, as a person with historical understanding and seeing all that, and then as a person of faith, and from that perspective, what do you see? Where's this going? Like, if you could predict, I'm not asking you for official prophecy, but what do you think? What is the typical expectation of this unfolding from here and coming to a resolution of a place that is not going to just completely fall apart?
Thank you, and thank you for your passion for this. We're in uncharted territory. I like that you use the word patterns. Just when we look back at the past, we can't predict the future, but there are patterns. One pattern that we're seeing, it's a backlash. There's always a backlash. So in so many ways, what we're seeing in 2025 is a backlash to what happened in 2008 when Barack Obama became the first Black president. It's a backlash to 2014 and 2015, the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a backlash to 2020, the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery uprisings, right? So that's one of the reasons why I insist on saying white Christian nationalism, because there's a lot of different issues at stake here, but the through line is white supremacy and racism. So that is a historical pattern that we're seeing, but history is the study of continuity and discontinuity. What stays the same and what changes over time. One of the differences now is that we're seeing at a federal level these anti-democratic forces so ascendant. We've seen it at the state level actually throughout history. You could look just next door to Mississippi, where I also used to live, as a very tragic example of how that happens historically. But now we're seeing it in the federal government, and the reality is, what's different about now is we can't wait till the next election for change. The way authoritarianism works is it uses the legitimate levers of democracy, like a presidential election, to get into power. Then once they're in office, they dismantle the democratic apparatus so that your vote, if you can vote, won't have the same power that you're used to having. And so now is the time of activism and protest, like not even in 2016 had we seen this before. And honestly, I wish I had more good news and a note of hope, but the reality is the way things are going will get very, very, very worse.
Give us some instructions. What should we be doing? And I'm not talking about praying and talking, because I get that. We can pray and we talk and we, just like we're doing now, but we need some directives.
I'll go in my second book, it's called How to Fight Racism, and there's a framework I give in there called the Arc of Racial Justice. It's an acronym that stands for Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. So on the awareness piece, you hold your own screening of God and country. Have a watch party in your living room or online. People need to know what we're up against. There's a new book so this film was based on the book, The Power Worshippers. The Power Worshippers. Get that book and read it. It's by an investigative journalist named Catherine Stewart. Catherine Stewart, just this week, came out with her latest book called Money, Lies, and God. You have to read it. You have to read it, and you have to read it in community. Because what you're seeing in the headlines daily is the tip of the iceberg of how this movement got into power and what it plans to do. So build your awareness in those ways. Relationally, white Christians, you have so much work to do.
Yeah.
So you asked what I would say to a Trump voter. The reality is, this is not a single conversation kind of an issue here. The reality is, there's a book by a pastor in Phoenix, Arizona named Caleb Campbell. He wrote the book Disarming Leviathan. Now, Caleb Campbell is a former neo-Nazi skinhead who came to Jesus and then spent years infiltrating white Christian nationalist groups to understand their culture and their thinking and their ideology. And his proposal to white Christians is we need some of you to be missionaries to white Christian nationalists. You need to know the culture, the questions, the ideology so well that you can actually have conversations with them and disciple them out of this horrible ideology, and that takes time. So then, what do black folks and other people of color do? We band together in communities of solidarity. Black folks are used to the government not working for them, but often being explicitly against us, right? Not quite in the same way that we're seeing, but we do have that gear of resistance. Now we need to partner with other folks, Latino folks, immigrant groups, Native Americans. We need to form coalitions for increased power. And then comes the commitment aspect, which means not just staying the course, but committing to policy change. At which point we really need to talk about working on a local level. The truth be told, some of y'all are going to need to run for office. And that's not just state or federal office, that's school boards, that's library boards, that's city councils. We need other people to present an alternative witness to what white Christian nationalists are doing in the halls of power. So it's going to take a lot of work, and my last word on this question is we may not win. My ancestors labored and prayed and worked and resisted for freedoms they never saw. But because they did, we have them, which are now under threat. But you may be working for a day that you will never see, but the people who come after you will.
Thank you guys for hosting this. It's like a bomb in Gilead. I've been on the front edges of Christian tables of togetherness, as my husband and I have been were at a predominantly white church trying to change the currents of race and how it impacts Christianity. And I'm brutally wounded as a part of that experience for 16 years. I openly wept here today because I've been one of those voices that's been demonized for speaking truth. One of the things that's been so unsettling to me over the last month is the eerie silence of leadership at the federal, the state, and even in the church. There's an eerie silence happening as we are watching daily headlines, sometimes 10 a day, of the atrocities that are happening. It's anarchy, as I feel, as I define it. And I don't understand, because I'm asking you as a person of influence, where are the voices? There's darkness right now. And it's just like we're all in a straitjacket watching things happen that this documentary affirms this has been rolling for a very long time. We're just seeing the results of it. So where is our government right now? Where is our Congress? Where are our church leaders? I mean, from your vantage, where are they?
Well, first of all, thank you for being that voice in your community. And I'm very aware of the pain of being in these predominantly white spaces and Christian spaces and them being unresponsive or even opposing you. I know that's very hard. Where are the voices? They're out there, but first of all, I think we're all still in a bit of shock. We're all still reeling. We're all still trying to catch our breath and figure out what the heck is going on, which is part of the strategy, right? Is to flood the airwaves, be chaos agents, confuse us with so much information, disinformation. These firings that just happened of a 4-star general who happened to be black, and then also Navy attorneys. That's Friday night. That's on purpose, right? So understand that we're all just trying to wrap our heads around this. Then, because there's so much going on, people are gonna have to pick a lane. You can't be outraged about everything. You should be outraged. But pick what you're going to focus your outrage, which should turn into action on. Now, I'm trying to be a voice. If you want to hear voices, The Convocation is a podcast that I host with Kristen Dumais, who is in there. Robert P. Jones, who founded the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI. This is another voice. Go to prri.org. They give statistical, social science, sociological information about white Christian nationalism. There's a website called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Amanda Tyler was here at Second Baptist. She helped start that. Christians Against Christian Nationalism has whole resources for churches to use, right? So let us not fall into the trap of thinking that nobody's doing anything. No one's doing anything. Let's not fall into, because that lends to the cynicism and the sense of powerlessness. The reality is, half the country did not vote for this. And we're out here, and what we're trying to do is mobilize and organize in the face of a deliberate onslaught meant to confuse and keep us off balance. And by the way, if you're looking for a voice that you don't hear, maybe you're that voice.
So I just spent this past week at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, which is one of, if not the largest conferences put on by the Black church here in America. And one thing that continued to stand out to me is what you just said. We have lots of voices, but I'm concerned about where the Bayard Rustins are, where the organizers are, the folks who can pull people together and hold them together over a period of time to do this work. So it seems to me like we've got a lot of the MLK, some of them were on this film, like Reverend Barber, but where are the organizers, the people that are doing the work behind the scenes and all of that? Who are those folks, and how do we support them? How do we find them? And how do we follow them?
Thank you. Local.
Yeah.
This is interesting when you bring up MLK, because in 1955, in December, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus, they didn't just start a boycott out of nothing. They already had an organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association, which had been doing local work and activism for Black civil rights. And so there was already a mechanism in place when this moment came. And then it was the MIA that said, you know what, we need to put out a statement about the boycott. Who do we need? Who's going to speak for us? And there was a young preacher who had just come into town, freshly minted PhD, and his name was Martin Luther King Jr. And they said, would you go and address journalists and tell them what we're doing? And thus began his national presence with a local movement. And everywhere the Southern Christian Leadership Conference went, King's nonprofit, there was a local organization on the ground that could receive them, connect them locally in the community, and mobilize them. So you want to ask, where are the organizers? They're probably right here in this room. They're definitely in this city. And yes, I personally believe that as human beings, we do need symbols. We do need human beings who can sort of represent the movement, speak for people. It takes time, y'all. It's been a month. It's been a month. And we're in uncharted territory. So I believe those leaders will emerge. And the reality is they're not just going to come popping from on high. They're going to rise up from local communities.
I think it's time that Second Baptist, St. Mark's, who I consider a sister church, and other churches like us in the area get together and be that voice and start being that advocate, and that's a starting point, and it can grow from there.
We're on it. Thank y'all so much for being here today. I know your time is precious. Thanks to Jemar. Will you help me thank Jemar? his is a voice worth listening to, whether it's his podcast, his books, his lectures, whatever. Substack. Jemar will be a moral, spiritual guide for you. So follow Jemar. This very morning I heard this statement, and I think maybe it will be a comfort to you after what we just saw. I know we just watched some heavy stuff. Feel all that. Process all that. But don't stay there. What I heard this morning was this: tyranny needs fear to survive. Democracy needs courage to survive. So breathe for a second. Feel all the things, and then go be courageous people. Peace be with you as you do that. Thanks for being here.